everyone, and thank you for joining us for Food Secure Canada's first virtual movement gathering, Cultivating Change, a just transition to a regenerative food system. We're excited to have more than 1,000 people joining us virtually from across Turtle Island to engage and share in this next week of programming. My name is Milana Roberts, and I'm chair of the board of Food Secure Canada, and I'm joining you today from the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This space is also often referred to as Toronto. As I continue to live, work, learn, and share the benefits of these lands, I've developed an ongoing practice to not only acknowledge whose land I'm on, but consider how my work benefits Indigenous peoples and the many territories they have stewarded from time immemorial. As we come together across these diverse landscapes with rich histories, traditions, stories, and peoples, I would like all of us to take a moment to reflect on this question. As you do that, I would like to encourage you to take a moment to identify whose land you're situated on. Take a moment and to encourage you to consider the treaties that govern this land, the languages of the peoples. If you do not know whose land you are on, please take a moment to look it up. You can use the website we've linked in the chat to learn more about the land you are on and reflect on this question. As we continue to enter into this afternoon's discussion, I would like to ask you to hold this reflection with a commitment to not only reflect, but consider how the tools, discussions, and connections made at Cultivating Change's gathering can support you to act, honor, and respect our status as treaty peoples. Now, over these past few weeks, many have asked me the question of why now? Why come together in the midst of a global pandemic and bring a national kind of movement of people together to consider how we can address the challenges of this moment? Well, to answer that question, in many ways, this event has been years in the making. It's not about why now, but about the opportunity to come together in this moment. As a board, staff, and organization, we've been reflecting on the many tensions, challenges, and inequities that impact the food system and our work. Over the past 2 years, we've worked to critique our internal capacity, systems of governance, and how we focused our work to really understand how to both respond to the needs of the grassroots food movement actors and center the leadership and work of Indigenous, Black, people of color working in the food movement and food policy processes to support their work. We've asked questions about how we can advance our work and this goal, while also building the capacity of the broader food movement to embed anti-racist and decolonial approaches and principles in our everyday work. After many months of learning, unlearning, questioning, seeking guidance, and working at personal and organizational scales, we continue to move, although imperfect, toward this goal. While still grappling with these questions, because to be honest, we don't have all the answers, but we recognize there's much to learn. And as an organization, we have made a strong commitment to do this work in a meaningful and accountable way. And this event is part of that commitment to bring all of you as individuals, as organizations, as activists, as leaders into this conversation to join us. For us, this moment has been difficult as we've decided how to support these movements and advance this work. It was challenging for us to decide not to release an organizational statement in response to the systemic violence and pervasive racism that both Black, Indigenous, and many communities of colors face as they continue to endure these challenges, not only within our food system, but within our broader world. With many of our Black and Indigenous board members, myself included, we have a board that is half Black and Indigenous and have been inundated with requests for our time, our labor, our lived experience to support communities in this time of need. And we didn't want to rush a statement that we weren't able to live up to based on our capacity, our experience, and the best role for us in the work of the food movement at this time. So many organizations have made pledges in this moment and spoken lip service to the needs and to their willingness to change and center these issues. But we did not do that. We felt like it was important to provide the support and create space for the conversations and continue to drive the work to unpack these challenges. We are really interested in creating this space to not only uplift diverse organizations, but engage and advance the interests and work of BIPOC leaders and groups. As I mentioned, FSC is extremely proud to have diverse leadership on our board, with a board that is half Black and Indigenous, and we are keen to create spaces that build the sovereignty and power of these communities. Now, I would be kidding you if I said representation was enough, but we still have a long way to go, and we are committed to building more structures, policies, and spaces that have allowed us to work differently, not only with Indigenous peoples and with BIPOC leaders and communities, but to also explore Indigenous governance models and bring into the question of power, committing to naming tensions and injustices within the food movement, and hoping to create a safer, more engaged space to learn alongside you. Now, these are challenging conversations. They're imbued with the lived experience of many who will be joining us on panels, in working groups, and as attendees at this event. So I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the challenging nature of these conversations. Throughout this event, we will name anti-racist and decolonial approaches as an essential tool to combating and reframing food system challenges. We know these can be challenging topics to unpack, so FSC has provided spaces for registered attendees to caucus together, to convene and unpack challenging issues together. Today, following the opening plenary, there will be an open space discussion led by an Indigenous-oriented trauma support therapy specialist, an approach called IFOT. Participants can also sign up for one-on-one debriefs with a trauma-informed mental health professional, and discussion spaces have been curated to support Black identifying folks in community-specific discussion. So please do take a look at the program with details linked in the chat, or using the WOVA app to be able to access these special programming and important spaces to unpack. Now, I have to acknowledge, we have strived to create as many supports as possible, but there are limitations and constraints to provide support resources for all attendees. We have limitations of time zones and don't have, unfortunately, the capacity to support all the diverse communities, perspectives, and experiences. So we've made a conscious choice to uplift and create space for communities who are most disproportionately impacted and marginalized by racism and inequity in the food system. And we encourage you, even outside of this event, to access other resources and connect in community to advance and work through some of the challenging topics we're bringing forward. Topics we hope to center in this event include things like unpacking and exploring challenges of material deprivation and access to culturally appropriate food and clean water, experiences that are structured by systemic racism, colonialism, impacted by gender and class, and which have been acutely aggravated by the pandemic. Issues around power, voice, and controlling the narrative of the food movement and policymaking processes, which are often undertaken by and led by groups and networks and leaders of European and white descent, with relative class privilege, race privilege, and economic privilege. And last, but certainly not least, we hope to discuss the challenges around self-sufficiency, sovereignty, identity, and cultural survival challenges expressed through food systems work. At a time with many crises and deep emotional fatigue, this event is working not only to raise these issues to the fore, but to build greater unity and understanding across differences. We hope to build a shared narrative of the food movement's experience, as well as create opportunities to consider how to show up as allies, how to engage and effectively manage challenge, conflict, and build increased capacity for community-driven health, food, nutrition, and land systems. Now, we're not doing this all on our own. We need you at the table to make this work. So I have a call to action for all of you listening. For this work to truly take place during this week together and far beyond, it is imperative that we collectively work to create brave and safe as possible spaces as we navigate across these difficult issues together, but of course separately in our socially isolated homes. Using the WOBA platform, you'll be able to interact, reach out, ask questions to other attendees, to panelists and speakers, to build a virtual community to connect to each other. We will also be live streaming this event on Facebook, and we encourage you to share your thoughts and reflections, questions and curiosities using the hashtag Cultivating Change 2020 or Cultiver 2020. We will be also providing simultaneous interpretation to ensure people can communicate in the language they are most comfortable with. That will be provided in English and French for those who need it. A big thank you to Isanel Engrich and Jean Moreau for their support to do this. To be able to access these services, you can just see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's an option for interpretation, and you can scroll down to be able to select your preferred language. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and co-conspirator, Food Secure Canada's Executive Director, Gisèle Yasmine, to walk us through some of the goals and objectives of today's event en français. Gisèle?
Merci, Malana. Je suis ravie d'être avec vous ce matin. Je suis présentement dans le territoire des peuples Musqueam, qui sont une source d'inspiration de plusieurs façons. Comme plusieurs Premières Nations de la côte ouest, les femmes ont un meilleur statut que les sociétés d'origine européenne. On peut apprendre beaucoup de ces gens-là. Il y a des traditions impressionnantes dans l'artisanat et dans plusieurs domaines de l'économie, de la culture et dans les systèmes alimentaires. Les Musqueam sont assez intéressants aussi parce qu'il y a souvent eu des mariages avec des personnes d'origine chinoise. C'est quelque chose qui va être exploré un peu dans ce programme cette semaine. Mon intention personnelle est d'apprendre de plus en plus à propos des peuples autochtones et d'être une bonne alliée et d'apprendre à tous les jours comment je peux faire mieux. Nous voulons vous expliquer pourquoi nous avons organisé cet événement qui a été conçu comme une série de conversations et d'ateliers en ligne afin d'explorer les intersections et les systèmes alimentaires, les mouvements antiracistes, de décolonisation et de justice environnementale. Ces enjeux sont devenus de plus en plus évidents avec la pandémie de la COVID-19, tel qu'indiqué dans notre plan d'action politique « Accroître la résilience et l'équité » qui a été publié au mois de mai. Cultiver le changement mettra en valeur le travail des leaders autochtones, noirs et racisés, œuvrant dans l'alimentation et renforcera la conscience ainsi que la portée des approches antiracistes et décoloniales au sein du mouvement alimentaire, tel qu'expliqué par Mélana. En tant que mouvement alimentaire, comme tous les mouvements sociaux, nous avons besoin des changements audacieux de la ferme à la table, en passant par la génération des terres nourricières autochtones, afin que tous puissent avoir accès à une alimentation saine, juste et durable. Cependant, il est impossible de réaliser ce changement sans intégrer la réconciliation, la décolonisation et la justice raciale dans un développement de politiques et de programmes qui façonnent nos systèmes alimentaires et œuvrer pour atteindre les objectifs de développement durable des Nations unies. Maintenant, je vais projeter mon écran, un instant, pour, voilà. Pardon. Comment je fais pour aller à la diapo précédente? OK, voilà. Donc, nous avons 3 objectifs très spécifiques. Vous pouvez les lire en français et en anglais sur l'écran. D'abord, présenter et mettre en valeur le travail des représentants des communautés noires, racisées et autochtones en matière d'alimentation, par exemple en invitant des orateurs qui dirigent le travail des systèmes alimentaires dans les communautés noires et autochtones et chez les personnes de couleur, en soulignant leurs défis, leurs réussites, leurs besoins d'alliance entre mouvements alimentaires, d'autres mouvements sociaux et la société en général. Deuxièmement, de mettre en évidence les connexions et les intersections entre le travail des systèmes alimentaires et d'autres aspects de l'antiracisme et de la décolonisation afin d'ouvrir la discussion sur des espaces qui laissent place aux connexions et offrent des opportunités pour d'autres formes d'alliances. Et troisièmement, renforcer la conscience et la capacité des approches antiracistes et décoloniales au sein du mouvement alimentaire lui-même, en particulier chez les dirigeants, tout en donnant aux décideurs politiques l'espace nécessaire pour qu'ils et elles prennent part à ce travail. Je vais arrêter de partager mon écran. Nous avons un très beau programme avec la projection du film Red Chef Revival ce soir, des séances sur la souveraineté alimentaire autochtone et noire, et je dois dire c'est la première fois que le RAD, le Réseau pour une alimentation durable, a des séances sur la souveraineté alimentaire noire comme telle. On a fait des choses sur la justice raciale, mais pas spécifiquement là-dessus. Un mini-spectacle par vidéo avec aussi une allocution de Buffy Sainte-Marie qui sera demain soir à 17h30 heure de l'Est par vidéo exclusif. Il faut être inscrit pour cette activité. Et des séances sur l'économie solidaire, le plaidoyer, le travail décent, l'alimentation scolaire et relier les mouvements locaux et mondiaux. Je tiens à remercier nos bailleurs de fonds, nos commanditaires qui sont indiqués sur la plateforme et sur notre site Internet. Cet événement n'aurait pas été possible sans cet appui. J'aimerais aussi vous remercier d'avoir pris le temps de vous inscrire pour participer. En vous souhaitant une très bonne semaine, je passerai la parole une dernière fois à Melana qui présentera les membres du comité organisateur et mettra en scène notre plénière d'ouverture. Je repasserai le flambeau à Melana maintenant. Elle vous adressera la parole en anglais. Over to you, Melana.
Merci, Giselle. This event, as Giselle mentioned, has really been part of a thoughtful consideration of how Food Secure Canada can work differently. And we have spent a lot of time in that reflection about thinking about how we can interconnect themes. So this event is guided by daily themes, ideas, and areas that have continued to reoccur throughout Food Secure Canada's engagement of the food movement over the last 14 years, particularly. The themes will allow us to link struggles of land, people, and the environment to consider what a just and regenerative transition to a new food system could look like. So the themes to start off beginning today will be food and culture on day 1. On day 2, which is Friday, healing and nutrition. On day 3, which is Monday, gender and generations. And on day 4, power, voices, and governance. And on the final day of activities on Wednesday, we have protection, regeneration, and conservation of land and food. And as I mentioned, these themes will not only be a way for us to conceptualize and connect ideas, but also a way for us to connect to movements that are working alongside the food movement, and for us to consider how our relationships across difference also connect across gender, across generations, from present work to past work to future work, across policy areas and across organizing spaces and places. And we encourage you to reflect on these themes, not only to guide your discussions in these conversations over the next couple days, but also to inform your ongoing work and policy proposals and thinking to inform our broader work here and your work with Food Secure Canada. So it is my pleasure to also share this postcard with all of you. Many of you have hopefully received this postcard as you registered in the mail. And this was an opportunity for Food Secure Canada to give a gift to you as you start this journey with us. This postcard is not only a gift, but an opportunity to call you into action during this work. On the back of the postcard, you'll see some text on 2 columns, and one is to help introduce you and bring you in to thoughtfully think about your engagement with us through this work. Our goal of this event was to learn and grow our understanding and practices around racial justice and decolonization within the food system work that we all do. And so we're asking all of you to take a moment, whether it's before the incredible plenary we're going to enter into, or whether it's at the end of today's sessions, or perhaps it's in this exact moment, taking a moment to reflect on the specific question we're posing to you is, what are you bringing to this gathering to build a regenerative food system? And we're asking you to take a moment to reflect on that question and hold that. And at the end of the sessions, we're hoping to come back to you to ask you, how will you use what you've learned to seed racial justice and decolonization in your work? As an organization doing work across the country from coast to coast to coast, we're not only keen to think about the national picture, but to build capacity on the ground in your communities, in your regions, to build connections with each other and across the difference, to be able to learn together and also to impact at various scales, the local, the kind of regional, as well as the national. And we are really looking to you to help us do that work. So please do take the time to reflect on how we can start to seed that change. Now, as we come to kind of the close of our opening, I would love to move to talk a little bit about the plenary session, but I would be remiss to do that if I didn't start off by sending a deep moment of thanks before I introduce our guide into the plenary session, Dawn Morrison. And just as a note, as I mentioned, filling this out, one of the things that I would really like to ask everyone to do is, even beyond these sessions, is to take this postcard and keep it with you, whether you put it on your fridge, whether you have it at your desk where you work, whether you have it on your nightside table as a way to carry the learnings and the reflections from this event and the commitments into your everyday work. So as I mentioned, I wanted to share some deep gratitude and thanks to a number of people who have really gone above and beyond to make sure this event was possible, working across many time zones, at quite a distance from each other across the country, and also during a global pandemic. In addition to sending a lot of gratitude to our executive director, Giselle Yasmin, I'd like to acknowledge Food Secure Canada's board members, particularly Susanna Clausen and Naomi Robert, who were part of the convening committee who brought this event to life. I'd also like to extend a deep gratitude to Kevin Wong from the WA Foundation, and Dawn Morrison and Jolene Andrew from the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, who've been integral partners in helping to think through incredibly important conversations, tensions, challenges, and approaches to bring this event to life. And last, but certainly not least, to the incredible, dynamic, and passionate staff team at Food Secure Canada, particularly Rachel Chang and Emily Levesque, who have been just absolute supports and rock stars to make this event possible. You'll probably interact with them throughout, and as you can see them helping people navigate in the chat, they are incredibly helpful, and I encourage you to send your gratitude to them as well via the WOVA chat and on social media, because this would not be possible without them. Now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our lead to bring us into the plenary session. I'd like to introduce Dawn Morrison. Dawn is a Secwepemc ancestry and the founder and curator of the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty. Since 1983, Dawn has worked and studied horticulture, ethnobotany, adult education, and restoration of natural systems in formal institutions. She's also had her own personal and community healing and learning journey. Following the year she spent teaching Aboriginal adult education, Dawn has dedicated her time and her energy, her deep energy, to spend and teach land-based healing and learning, which led her to her life's work of realizing herself more fully as a developing spirit-aligned leader of the Indigenous food sovereignty movement. For any of you who know Dawn, you know that she's consistently organized and held space for more than 15 years, mobilizing knowledge and networks toward a just transition from the basis of decolonizing food systems in community to networks toward a just transition, from the basis of decolonizing food movements to regional and international networks where she's become internationally recognized. Dawn's work on the decolonizing research and relationships is focused on creating a critical pathway of consciousness that shines a bright light on the cross-cultural interface where Indigenous food sovereignty meets social justice, climate change, and regenerative food systems research, action and planning, as well as policy governance. Some of the projects Dawn is leading include the Wild Salmon Caravan, which I encourage you all to take a look into. She's got a great link on Facebook, and hopefully that can be shared in the chat at some point. The Indigenous Food and Freedom School, and Dismantling Structural Racism in the Food System, and the National Government Food Security and Sovereignty Project. It is my absolute pleasure and probably all of your pleasure as well, to be able to spend this morning with Dawn, for those of you in the morning, and the afternoon for us in the Eastern time zone. I'm going to turn it over to Dawn to open us up in a welcoming prayer. Thank you, Dawn.
Wow, thank you, Rachel. I just so appreciate your courage, your words, and the powerful way in which yourself as a young Black woman is opening us up today, and the work that you've all done to bring us here together. It's really feels quite actually emotional for me, because it's, 15 years in working with Food Secure Canada. This is what it's come to, and it's very exciting. So I thought I would just start with a few words. I think our opening plenary that I've been honored to ask to moderate and curate, we have some amazing Indigenous thought leaders and friends and allies who are here to help us feel into this space of decolonizing food systems from within our respective ethnic backgrounds and realities that we live as people working in the food system. And so our work that I'm going to share with you, the cross-cultural interface framework that I've developed to help hold space in what's often very contentious and triggering conversations, and to give us some structure, create some ethical spaces of engagement to do that. And so by nature of the framework, which I will introduce after, it is like a prayer in itself, because it's transformative. It holds space for kind of, as Alana's going to speak to, resting in some of the tension that we carry in this work as Indigenous people, people of color, people who are underrepresented in the food system, and who experience a lot of marginalization. So the process itself will be like a prayer, because the title of the gathering, A Just Transition to a Regenerative Food System and Cultivating Change, the transformation and the change that's happening in the world. We as Indigenous peoples, it is well understood within our cultures and our worldviews and our ways of knowing that we shape our world based on how we observe it. So showing up with intention, acknowledgement of in a place-based way. I know that across Canada, one of the points of contention that I've had in working at a pan-Canadian approach or scale is that there are 98 nations of Indigenous peoples, 11 major Indigenous language groups, within each one of those 11 a huge amount of diversity. And so it's really hard to work in a pan-Canadian approach. But I bring the intention, and I set the intention in a good way to help us be in this work together in a truthful yet a gentle way, and to make that change and be the change we want to be, to live the reality, and to really try and balance out some of the power imbalances in power and privilege, and to realize ourselves more fully, to embody a health relational practice, which I think Alana, she is going to share some amazing work that she's been doing as an Indigenous focus oriented therapist, and help us be in that sacred space together. So regenerating the food system, Great Spirit, we ask for your guidance. We ask that you show us what we need to know to be able to attune to your higher power and the infinite intelligence of the ability of nature to regenerate and to heal ourselves and our planet, and all of the relationships to the land, the water, the people, the plants, the animals that provide us with our food. But it starts with ourselves, and we really help us today with that work. And I'm really grateful to be here in the Hunkaminam and Squamish speaking peoples in Coast Salish territory, and just really also grateful to be in this virtual space with you all. So without further ado, I would like to now introduce the framework that I'm going to use to moderate the plenary, and then I'll lead you into the discussion. I'll introduce Alana. So this framework was kind of 15 years in the making. It's been shaped and formed by a lot of Indigenous scholars, Indigenous elders, and Indigenous peoples who are working in a collective right mind within the rapidly expanding Indigenous Food Systems Network, where we've been mobilizing knowledge and networks. And a lot of the knowledge that underlies this, the Indigenous ways of knowing and epistemology, has been entrusted and shared with the world with the intention of creating change and better understanding. There are different ways of knowing beyond the Western science-based kind of techno-bureaucratic framework that asserts to be the ultimate voice of truth and reason. And this tool is really a tool designed to give structure and to say this is a process of understanding, coming to deeper understanding, and there's infinite potential in the world, and there's a lot of strategies that live within the potential, but a lot of that is contradicting, it's paradox, can be full of, places of tension and conflict, but this tool is really designed to bring us through that process. Following an Indigenous way of knowing, we use metaphors to help teach us about nature. So in this case, we're using the life cycle of the wild salmon to bring us through the process. And we apply what we call, what Manulani Meyer, a well-known Indigenous scholar from Hawaii, calls the holographic epistemology, which is really aligned with quantum science that now has come to understand what Indigenous people have said, that we shape the world based on how we observe it, and the change and the transformation happens in a way where process matters as much, or maybe even a little more than content. So we enter into the stage in the east, also the direction where the sun comes up in the morning, and also the stage where the wild salmon are conceived at the egg stage. We enter into this journey and this process by identifying key points that help us understand the different realities that are being expressed in the food system. So in this case, it's the racialized realities, that the different ways that racialized, racism is expressed within the different groups, and the different ways that colonization is being expressed, or systemic oppression. So I'm happy to have on the plenary both Alana, Sagech Ward, and Leslie Campbell and Sarah Dent. And so they'll each share some points of entry and just some of their work to help us better understand what their reality is and what they're working on. As we go through the process, we come to better understand as we mature, as the salmon grows into the junior stage. I guess that's kind of like would be compared to a teenager stage. We start to understand there's more than just ourselves, and there's ways that we interface with other realities. And some of those ways are complementary and some are contentious. Complementarity gives us a place to start from, to work together. But the contention, we don't bypass that. There's been a lot of fear around conflict and, you know, the trauma, where that trauma often is embodied. But rather than bypass that, we say, well, that's actually where the solutions are. And that's where often there's a lot of paradox and contradictions and great mystery and gaps of knowledge, things we don't know about each other. So by resting in those contradictions or those conflicts, we can then ask what I call coyote questions, or you could call them wicked questions. And then from there, we may not have answers. We probably won't have answers to most of it. So it's not a definitive process, but we can identify potential and strategies that live within the gaps of knowledge. So I want to lead that into now introducing Alana Young. So I'm just gonna, Alana is an Indigenous land-based pedagogy, genocide-informed, focused-oriented trainer. And she is trained in Indigenous research epistemologies, methodologies, and working with complex trauma. Alana's, the focus of her PhD was to work with elders, Indigenous elders, to develop a pedagogy for land-based health education programs. Her postdoctoral work looked at how the Indigenous Elders Medicine Collective applied the pedagogy to the urban Hasisim Indigenous Health Research Education Garden at UBC Farm, and interviewed Indigenous land-based initiatives in BC to develop an Indigenous food sovereignty framework. Lana's genocide-informed elements to work with complex trauma will be introduced at the in her piece of the plenary. It is a strength-based, body-centered skill designed for those interested in developing tools for regenerative, socially just land-based approaches. So I will hand it over to Alana now.
Thanks, Dawn, and for everyone who has put this whole interactive way to join in, and I'm happy to share some of the tools. So, Bushan and the way Maganidag, Maga Gaganina Megarendishnakasa, Amiskin Dodam, Anishinaabe Medekwe, Pegwas Donshaba, Opasquak and Dao. I've just introduced myself in my language from my homelands in Treaty 1 and Treaty 8, zooming it to you from Humathguim territories and the sister host unceded Coast Salish territories in UBC area. So, yeah, so I was going to share some tools with you that we've been doing in community. So I've been working with Indigenous elders back home in Manitoba in the rural and urban setting here in at UBC. And so my hands are raised to the elders in the Medicine Collective. I'm a member of that group that comes together to look at holistic land-based approaches to wellness and also to food sovereignty. So primarily this genocide-informed tool that I'm going to share with you in this plenary is based on the work of Shirley Turcotte. So if you're interested in more of she does a lot of experientials. If you YouTube Shirley Turcotte, especially around COVID, using these body-based and land-based tools to help us navigate trauma. And we kind of decolonize trauma by saying that really the trauma becomes our wisdom, because it tells us what not to do, and that that underneath the trauma, we're doing pretty good. And so if we're just able to notice our body sovereignties, the space around us, we're able to notice and invite those elements to be with us, even in the face of trouble or complexities. So there's lots of room if we notice our body spaces and our physical spaces, and then all of the things that we're related to in creation comes up through the one body, but within a collective. And so that helps us remember our strengths, that we can bring that to the table. So I'm going to share a bit of that with you, and kind of maybe invite you to not face the Zoom straight on. So we want to protect our bodies. We want to hear what's happening, and then notice the space here. So often in many cultures, you know, we'll kind of clear off a body space, either with our intentions, our words, our songs. Often there's plants. So I've got cedar here, but I've also got the air, and I've got the bones in my hands, which are like the earth. And so, but first, to just get a little bit friendly with the physiology, what happens in our brains and in our bodies when there's some challenge. So I'll just briefly talk about that, make it more simple. And then I'll walk you through an experiential, through noticing the body, and I'll get you to jot down all the things that you notice that are your relatives, the relationships of the plants and the animals, and then even ancestors that come up through your bloodline. So what happens in trauma, just very briefly, trauma is something that happens generally outside the body, and our senses are impacted. So some reactions we might say to trouble, a troubling situation gets triggered, and we have a fight, flight, freeze, collapse response. And then all mammals have that, and it's very normal. And we can just get kind and curious with this tool. When we notice we're in a reaction. So a reaction might be like fight. And there's no real thinking usually when we're in a reaction. Something gets triggered in the now, sounds similar to something in the past, and we have a survival response. And it's these survival responses are about doing, right? Either I'm going to fight, or I'm going to run away, or I'm going to hide, like disappear, or I might play dead, collapse. So in the animal world, we might say a fight is like a bear, or flight might be like the deer. Freeze could be kind of like a chameleon response, blend in, or play dead. So kind of like the mouse. When there's a vicious cat, what looks like a vicious cat might look like a similar vicious cat from before. So we just say times visiting from before, and we just get kind and curious. We notice, oh yeah, I'm having this response. and go, oh, okay, so what's under there? Because you survived. And so there's a lot of wisdom under there about how you survived that might want your attention to help you in today. Because when you're in fight, freeze, collapse, your adrenal system is going, and cognition kind of goes offline because it's busy about doing. So how do we get cognition back online? Right? So these are some of the tools that I'll share with you. So first we have to notice that we might be in a physiological response. And so how we just get kind and curious with that, like, oh, I'm being a bear, or oh, I'm being a chameleon, and or I'm pretending to play dead. Like the mouse. And we're just kind and curious with this tool. We just notice. We don't try to change or fix it. We just notice what else is there that's helping. So that's kind of where we're at. These tools will help us notice if we're in a triggered state or in a reaction. Time is visiting. How can we notice the medicine or the relationships about how we survived trouble, so that those relationships come up through the body, and so let me just see. I can't see all of you, but I'm going to try to have you notice, see what it's like to kind of not take the Zoom room straight on, because it can be kind of confronting and kind of fry your senses, and it can be hard to notice what's under there in the body space. So what's going to happen here, I invite you to have a pen and a paper. I'm going to ask some questions and kind of lead you through noticing your body, noticing if there's any, relationships that you notice. And when you notice them, there's no right or wrong way to notice, because you have your own body sovereignty. And I want you to notice your land space here. So it's a good idea to have some room there that you can notice your space. Everybody's got a bit of space, because often if we're in fight, flight, freeze, collapse, we feel like we don't have space. And so if we can notice that physically, so sovereignty in the body space, see how I'm clearing it off, and then in the physical space around you here. Nice to know you got lots of company in here and here. Okay, so just know right away to do this. Make the activity work for yourself. So if something different shows up than what I'm suggesting, go with that. So just take a minute to kind of allow your brain to drain into your body with each breath. So this is a clearing space and noticing your body with each breath. Almost like a file, allowing your brain to drain. And this is kind of a noticing the body's information. And noticing breathing in through to the space around you. You're allowed to be comfortable there, so making any adjustments. We're just noticing. And if you were a piece of land today, maybe your water in there, what kind of land would you be? Just noticing the weather. With each breath, noticing the time of day. Or maybe you're noticing the season. Maybe your mountains. Maybe you're in the plains. What do you see? What do you hear? What are you sensing there? Are there any animals in your landscape there? Noticing, what are they doing? Or what are you hearing? Notice if there's any smells. And if there was a message in whatever's showing up there for you, what might that be? Just noticing a bit wider. Do you sense any packs of animals nearby? It doesn't have to make sense. Maybe there's a pod of whales somewhere off in the distance. Or a pack of horses. Just noticing into the collective. Now we're going to notice are there any other people there in your landscape? Are you sharing the space with others? Are there families there? Friends? just going to check in for the intergenerational. Are there others beyond our circles right now? Like ancestors, our parents? Are they there too, somehow sharing in this body, land, relational space? Maybe someone's phoning in. Just checking for all of the relationships that sustain us. We know a lot about challenging situations through time, through our ancestors. We've survived many pandemics, wars, scorched earth policies, displacements. We know a lot about surviving those. And so there's a kind of a tired. Just gonna check one more time in, just to give the tired, intergenerational knowing about how to survive. Just scan in there in the body with your awareness. There's a bone tired, intergenerational fatigue. And even if you don't remember that in your recent histories, we know about it now because we share injustices as well as the resiliences. So when I check in, it kind of feels like on top of my bones there's kind of a tired, and we're just going to give it a couple minutes of rest before we come back. So just notice in, where is that in your body? Is that in your chest, in your belly? Maybe it's in your legs. It's a kind of an ongoing, quiet thing. And we're just going to give it a bit of space to honor it and breathe into it. Just invite it to rest, and we sit beside it. And together we can rest for just a minute. No right or wrong way to do this. Just noticing, maybe you feel a particular ancestor resting with you. Or maybe there's a particular part of nature that's resting with you. A sunny beach. Just allowing that to emerge. Resting all together. Just really getting the support of the earth. Bodies know how to be connected to the waters, to the air, to the animals. Maybe you can hear some water. Just noticing what do you hear or sense there. Maybe the ancestors are resting with you. Taking one more moment to rest throughout time. To clear that space, to notice your body space, to notice all what's related there in your body that sustain us through trouble and challenges. It can help us to cultivate that change. It can help to restore our bodies and our relationships to the collective. To do this work in creative and diverse ways and can help support us. So I encourage you to take a moment to jot down any of the relationships that showed up for you there, any awarenesses. I know that my beach, the hearing of the water helped, me to kind of relax into the ebb and flow. The birds were like chirping and kind of having fun there. I noticed some deer and the kind of carrying of that in a forest was really nutritive there for my little body check-in there. Checking for relationships and in the collective. So when I noticed the ancestors there resting, it was about the water work. Come from a long line of women working with water and plants and foods as medicine. So I encourage you to, I think we're at time, and perhaps this little experiential there, checking through the body for what could help us when we bump up against challenge. These relationships can help us cultivate a different way of being as we move towards more socially just, well, in this case, food systems, but relationships. I think I was going to just ask Dawn to just share a little bit of what showed up for her, just to there's no right or, just to demonstrate that there's no right or wrong way to do this, because we have body sovereignty, we have spatial sovereignty within a collective. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Wow, how beautiful. That practice, that exercise, Alana, you've done that with me before in different therapy sessions, and it is really beautiful how it's so different from the reality and the methods that I guess more of a Western approach to psychotherapy that is more prescriptive, where this is really quite, it's the healing is expressed in a really deep, embodied way. And I've experienced that. And for me, what came up was I was on a hot summer day in my home territory in Shikwamaguluch, and it's so beautifully dry, and I could smell the sage in the air, and there was just a really gentle river wind coming off the river, and there was hawks flying above, and they were really happy. They were eating a lot of bugs and stuff from the garden, and there was crickets chirping, and the poplar trees were just, the leaves were dancing on the trees, and it really brought me to a beautiful place, and I don't feel as nervous anymore. So thank you. Really, really appreciate that.
Great, yeah, so thanks. You know, writing it down, because this body-centered stuff can be fleeting, because we get so used to being kind of busy up here. You know, if you're feeling like there's a lot, maybe sitting on the side and noticing the space there.
Yes.
You can give yourself some room there to bring in all of your land and birds and water and more of your senses.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Have a great session.
Yeah, I'm excited for the way that you've helped put us into some really beautiful space for the rest of our presenters here. And I would like to introduce the next one, Sakej James Ward. Sakej is a Mi'kmaq man from the Mi'kmaq Nation, from the community of Esquimalt-Petiche. I'm sorry, I didn't practice that. I feel very embarrassed about that. But Sakej, if you can correct me after I introduce you. So it's Burnt Church First Nation in New Brunswick. He belongs to the Anishinaabe Wolf Clan and is the father of 5 children and 4 grandchildren. Sakej is a veteran of both the Canadian and American militaries. He finished the military career at the rank of sergeant in an elite airborne unit. Sakej holds a bachelor's degree in political science with a specialization in international relations and a master's of arts degree in Indigenous governance. Sakej has a long history of protecting Indigenous people, communities, homelands, as well as our inherent responsibilities and freedoms. He has spent the last 27 years traveling North and Central America, helping to build Indigenous resistance to colonization. I'm super honored to invite Sakej to speak now. He's going to share with us, well, I'll just let Sakej tell us what he's going to share with us, and welcome, Sakej.
Thank you for having me. I'll begin. The community is called Esquimalt, and it means the lookout point. It is a little bit tough to catch, right? And I just said, I'm Mi'kmaq. I live in Vancouver, so I reside on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. I want to begin, in, I suppose in a way, I'm almost the alter ego of Dawn. I think everyone knows Dawn is a very generous and loving and positive person who is really bringing a lot of people together here. And behind the scenes, she had talked to me about this, and it's really about, you know, really unifying people behind a very important issue. And I refer to myself as the alter ego because one of the things I'm going to do today is probably just jump right into the contentious issues. And I want to expose those things. And as the Anishinaabe say, I want to be able to lay the bundle before you. And what that means is I want to be able to present the problems as they are, the issues as they are, not try to sugarcoat anything, present them as they are. So that way you could get into those dialogues, you could get into those discussions that at first feel maybe uncomfortable, but are very, very necessary. So as I said, my job today is really just get you really deep into these feelings or not feelings, but into these issues that are quite contentious amongst most groups. Excuse me. So I'll begin by saying really what I'm going to talk about is how colonial constructed food security strategies could be detrimental to indigenous food security, and why this means that our relationships can almost always be adversarial. And this is a kind of a tough thing to talk about because it's not something that's recent. It's not something that's just emerged in the last, say, decade or two. Really, to discuss this, I have to go back to the very beginning when we talk about contact. I'm going to frame this discussion in kind of political legal themes, and in a really, really tough way, I want to try to summarize the political legal history around the land issue for the last 500 years into the next remaining maybe 12 minutes. But hopefully I can do that in a way that we can understand it. Because if we understand this, we'll understand the very roots that cause the contentious feelings around issues like food security. So let's begin by talking about it this way. In 1491, this was an ecological paradise, the Americas. For indigenous people, there was an abundance of food. There was, whether you're talking about like elk herds, caribou herds, the fish, buffalo. This place was an ecological paradise that was prosperous. It was abundance and everything. It took care of our people in a very good, healthy way. And that's where we were in 1491. You look at today, the state of food security. There is a difference between food security for the typical Canadians and food security for indigenous people. So for for Canadians, I could generally say in a very kind of, in a very general way, that Canadians have experiencing food security in a way that has been quite prosperous to them for at least the last century. Now, obviously, COVID and stuff has really exposed some of the fragility behind food security, but I think really we could say it's been quite prosperous, typical Canadian. I could just see now, I'm going to take off my glasses just because I can see glare there. So Canadians have been feeling the effects of the abundance and the prosperity behind food security, being on indigenous lands and haven't taken them over. Now, compare that or contrast that to indigenous people today. And what we had in 1491 is a very different experience than what we have today. I could actually probably say indigenous food systems are near collapse. And what I mean by that is the traditional food systems. We're in a state of severe food crisis. I think we're all aware since the 70s, there's all kinds of statistics about this, that large mammals, their populations have declined by somewhere around 50%. Fisheries have been declining consistently. And for people who are mostly connected to the land, when I say mostly, like most nearest to the land, meaning that they get their food, their plants, their medicines directly from the land, they experience industrial destruction much quicker than, say, those who get their food from grocery market. Those who are in the cities and get it from there really don't see the decline of these things compared to people who have to go hunt or fish or collect medicines or collect plants. They're the ones that really acknowledge, wow, there's a rapid decline in our food system. So we're approaching a place of almost food collapse or collapse of our food systems. And for us, it's quite evident, right? So this disparity, this change between, say, 1491 and now, is actually, you can see it, it's evidenced, particularly in political, legal themes of colonization. So I want to take you back to that, and I want to talk about that. And hopefully I could really get to a point where you understand that the legal construct of this colonial state that we call Canada has set a certain system of order that favors the agrarian colonial style of food production and food systems over the indigenous hunter-gatherer style of food collection. So to understand this, we first have to go back to something called papal bulls. Now, at the fall of Rome, the period that came after that was the Dark Ages. This is the period where the Vatican basically had a lot of influence over European kingdoms. And in effect, kind of almost indirectly, but really with a lot of influence, the Vatican could persuade European kingdoms to basically do their will. And they did this by issuing these decrees known as papal bulls. And they were basically directives, in particular to rulers, on what is expected from a Christian kingdom. So in 1095, the Vatican had issued the papal bull around terra nullius. And what that means is uninhabited land. And it spoke to the idea of discovery, of perhaps a Christian kingdom sailing out and discovering a deserted island. And that's probably the best example. You find an island with no inhabitants, well, then they say you could claim that land under the sovereignty of the particular nation that you're sailing for. So this established the idea that you can claim land or declare sovereignty, absolute power, over some piece of territory that you think is completely uninhabited. So basically nobody could contest it, right? So this becomes a practice for European nations after that. And by 1455, there is another papal bull called Romanus Pontifex. And I'm going to read this to you. This is shortly or around the time of the Christian and Moor conflicts. So it reflects some of that. But also, this is the papal bull, basically international law, if you think of it that way, that Columbus had sailed with as his justification and direction as to what he does when he finds new lands. So let me read some of this. And again, this is just paraphrasing the papal bull. But Romanus Pontifex, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever and other enemies in Christ. What we're really talking about there are non-Christians. And all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, meaning the pagans, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, the dukedoms, the countries, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his or their use of profit. So people that were sailing on behalf of nations, as Columbus had did, were given these directives by way of international law of the Vatican to go out and subdue non-Christian kingdoms, to take everything they own and to subdue them into a state of perpetual slavery. So imagine that. That's Columbus's directive. And of course, that's exactly what he did. When he showed up in Boracay, which is Taino homelands, the first thing he did was declare sovereignty on behalf of Spain. Now imagine that. That's an act of war in international relations. Any other nation recognizes one nation coming in and declaring sovereignty over their nation, absolute power over their nation, is an act of war. But in this regard, what they're saying is you could go into non-Christian kingdoms and claim everything you want, not just resources, but you could claim their land, their governance, absolute power over everything. So Columbus goes back to Europe. He reports what he finds, and he mentions gold. He mentions he could go there by force and take it over and start extracting all this gold. So the Vatican's response was a papal bull issued a few months later in 1493 called Inter Caetera. Inca Terra was basically the giving of the Western world to countries that were loyal to the Vatican. And at this time, it was really Spain and Portugal. So the Vatican said, you can have the Western world, you're going to split it up between you. So it gave away indigenous nations, entire nations. This was a theft of continents. We don't even have a word for that. Genocide had to be created. The word genocide had to be created in response to the Jewish Holocaust, because there wasn't a word that described mass murder on that scale. In the same sense, we can't describe mass theft on a scale of continents. We don't even have a word for that yet. Mm-hmm. So you see the Vatican giving Spain and Portugal the New World by allowing their assertion of sovereignty to be recognized. And this is important because that assertion, all the way back to this time, is the very founding or the foundational principle in colonial law as to why that law could even exist. So the whole idea of Canadian law and the reason you could even have Canadian courts and judges is founded on this assertion of sovereignty. The ability to make laws and enforce laws is grounded in this assertion of sovereignty. If you don't have sovereignty, you can't do these things. But the problem here, obviously, is this sovereignty was declared in an extremely racist way. It was prejudiced and biased by Europeans who made the laws themselves and said, this is how I'm going to do it, regardless of the indigenous people's consent. So there was no seeing indigenous people as equals. As a matter of fact, by declaring that they could just go in and take things, one of the quickest ways that facilitated that was to see indigenous people not as humans, therefore can't have property. And that allows them to come in and take all the lands and resources that they want. So let's go ahead and fast forward this to 1651. You have a political theorist by the name of Thomas Hobbes. He writes a book called The Leviathan. And this is really important because as a political theorist, a political philosopher, he's providing the justifications to why certain governments can exist, why they can declare sovereignty over places and things like that, right? But to do so, he has to start from a fictional account of what he thinks happens prior to the existence of government and why government exists. So Hobbes speaks about this idea of state of nature. And he says in a state of nature, which in his mind means without government, people have all their freedoms. They could do whatever they want because there's no government above them to tell them otherwise. And in that state of nature, Hobbes insists that people will be murderers, they will be thieves, they'll be rapists, they'll be the worst that humankind could produce. So in his mind, without government, you have this condition that it's like a Mad Max kind of environment, pre-industrial Mad Max environment, where he described it as life in a state of nature would be nasty, brutish, and short. He said the purpose of government is to create laws and create order so you could create safety. So his prime concern about government was the idea of security, right? Now, he explains that when people come together to create some form of governance, they're entering into a social contract. And in the social contract, the way he sees it formulated is everybody gives up 100% of their freedoms, everything. So the idea of a freedom to enter into a marriage, the freedom to have children, the freedom to defend yourself, every freedom you could think of is given up, and they all come together. All these freedoms come together to create something called a sovereign. And the sovereign is the monarch at the time. And this monarch has all your freedoms and then will construct society by allowing you to have some of them back, usually in a very limited, diluted way. And then what we call freedoms no more, they call rights. So what comes from Hobbes is the idea that rights flow from the pleasure of the crown. And the crown is just another word for the sovereign. And this is important because that principle is still used today in Canadian law, that rights flow from the pleasure of the crown. The crown today is not a monarch in a sense, but it's parliament. It's the place that makes laws. So it's saying rights, and for indigenous people, this is probably sounds familiar. Our rights flow from the pleasure of parliament. So they are the constructors, definers. They will tell us the scope of our rights or the limitations of what that looks like. They become the ones who manufacture the idea of our rights. And we see this echo today in Canadian politics, particularly that in relationship with Indigenous people. So, and this, when I say rights too, you know, I'm also including the concept of land title, right? So after Hobbes comes another political theorist. In 1689, this is John Locke, and he writes a book called The Second Treatise on Government. And he kind of argues with Hobbes, and he says, you know what, the state of nature wasn't that bad. He thinks everybody was much more cooperative, as opposed to like very conflictual and willing to murder each other over any little thing. And what's important about Locke is he re-envisions the state of nature and says, because we were cooperative, our main concern wasn't security. Our main concern was the concept of managing property. And he said the purpose of government is to make laws that protect property. So the question now becomes, what is property, right? So Locke introduces this definition, and I think it was called the laws of labor of property, or something like the laws of appropriation, I believe it was called. And what it refers to is, how is property created? So Locke uses this analogy. He said, if you live on a common land owned by everybody, and an apple falls from a tree, no one owns it because it's owned by everybody. But the moment you bend over to pick up that apple, you invested labor, and now that becomes yours. So this concept of exclusive ownership, private property, is derived from Locke. And he goes on further. There's something called like the homestead principle. And what it means basically is that you can go out and claim unowned, that's key, unowned natural resources for yourself, as long as you put them to use. You can mark them, like we see, say cattle when they get branded, they're being marked. Or you could, like, for instance, fence off a large section of land. But the key was it's supposed to be unowned resources. So now when you have things like the doctrine of discovery laying claim to all of the Americas, it basically erased political, economic ownership, indigenous ownership. And I'm using that word loosely when I say ownership for indigenous people, over our lands. And it created an open area of unowned resources. So Locke is really trying to provide a justification for Europeans to come in and claim indigenous lands by way of settling and taking over those lands and building farms, building agrarian culture, because that's what European culture was at the time. To be able to create these large homesteads and farms and frontiers towns was all based on this idea of just going out and claiming. Both Locke and Hobbes actually made reference to the Americas, indigenous territory. And when Hobbes referred to lands, societies or absent societies as being brutish, nasty, and short, he was really referencing, in his mind, indigenous places. I don't want to say the word nations because he didn't recognize the nations. And Locke was also kind of getting at this idea that indigenous people don't work the land, therefore having invested property in it, invested labor in it, so it's not their property. It's up for grabs by Europeans coming in and wanting to claim it. Now, what's important about these two theorists is the Canadian social contract is built on those two theories. Now, it's more John Locke than it is Hobbes. But nonetheless, you'll see both of their theories echoed in the Canadian Constitution, Canadian laws, Canadian structure of power around what does a parliament look like and how to carry out lawmaking. And this is really problematic for indigenous people. And one is, obviously, European concepts of private property are biased in a sense that the state only is willing to protect those by law. Indigenous ownership. Now, I have a tough time with that English word because we don't really say ownership. If I could somehow explain this as responsibility. So if you were to carve out an area what we would think of as jurisdiction today. If we were to carve out an area and say there's jurisdiction over that, what we'd be saying in an indigenous way is that family or that community has responsibility to that specifically demarcated area, that land. And responsibility was recognized and protect indigenous concepts and natural law. We understood that a family or a community or nation would take care of those lands for the next 7 generations, not for the generation now, not to commodify and look for short-term solutions that would hurt others and hurt their future. So if we can understand that even the concepts around the relationships to the land were different. It wasn't private property where this particular one person of this generation could do whatever they want their land, even destroy it if they wanted to, at the expense of an indigenous concept where it's not ownership, but it's responsibility to take care of the next 7 generations. These things are very, very different. But European law, which comes from these doctrines of discovery and are influenced by both Hobbes and in particular Locke, are all designed to protect the property that was stolen from the indigenous people. So it was stolen and then it was transformed in this European concept of private property. So all of law in Canada, not all, Canadian law, all around property is all protected by the state. Now, a really good example of this would be the Oka crisis. We have a situation where small town of Oka is trying to expand a golf course onto Mohawk sacred territory or a sacred site. So what happens is the Canadian state, in a very John Locke sense, has to protect assertions of European private property. They send in 5,000 troops, including tanks. A lot of people didn't realize that there's tanks on standby to stop Mohawk warriors who are saying you can't assert this idea of private property on our sacred land. Now, let's put that in some kind of context about how important that act was to Canada. When Canada went to their last war, so we're talking in Afghanistan, they did not send as many troops to Afghanistan as they did to Oka. The ability to protect Canadians' assertion of private property on indigenous land was more important than the idea of going to war in Afghanistan. Now, we're talking about only going up against roughly, I believe it was like 30 Mohawk warriors versus going to Afghanistan, an entire nation. So what we could see is how much value Canadians will put, or the Canadian government will put on protecting European assertions of private property. Now, this is very problematic because indigenous food systems rely on our relationships to the land. And when I say land, I'm saying territory and all the life in it. So the word land, I think in English is a pretty empty word because we think of it as geographic. We think of it as just space. From an indigenous point of view, it means all the life in it. So whether we talk about animals, the fish, insects, plants, even the idea of the life of the land, the life of the mountains, the life of the river, these are all incorporated when we say that our word is for land. So our concepts around responsibilities to that land are not only like put secondary in Canadian law, they're actually displaced. And we have to really understand that. They're being displaced by Canadian assertions of sovereignty and the idea of European private property. So it's not as if they're both kind of compatible and we just got to find some kind of mechanism or format to work this out, that they'll work together. It isn't. One is designed to supersede the other. And that is the nature of settler colonialism. It's to destroy the indigenous world and replace it with a colonial world. And we see this in Canada. We see the exact template and model happening. And Canadian or colonial law is the justification to do that. So all of colonial law that's around protecting private property is about the destruction of indigenous responsibilities to their lands and their relationships and their use and occupancy of all those lands. And it's about destroying all that, erasing our existence to that land, and then replacing it with a European initially agrarian-based idea of private property of the land. And all that becomes extremely problematic because in order to create colonial food security strategies, a lot of times it's designed in a framework of colonial law, regulations, norms that become adversarial to indigenous ideas of how they use their land. So any kind of just strategies around food security have to take into the fact that this land is stolen from indigenous people and that we had our own strategies around this, our food systems and food securities that was utterly displaced and imposed a colonial system that benefits the colonizer by displacing us. So if we were to create any systems from an indigenous perspective, we have to take that last 500 years into account and understand how colonial law has been a weapon against indigenous idea of or connection to our land. So looking for solutions in those frameworks are adversarial to indigenous people. Any kind of future solutions have to exist outside the framework of colonial law, colonial assertions of strategy, of sovereignty, and the assertions of European private property. So I would, to wrap it up real quick, I would say that indigenous food sovereignty or food security has to also incorporate ideas of food self-determination. And what that means is we have to go back to the idea that indigenous people have the right to pick our own food systems, to use our lands and resources to facilitate those food systems. If we're going to look at these, having the ability to actually practice power, food sovereignty over our food systems. And then only then can we really start talking about food security. So basically that's all I have in a nutshell. That's like 500 years of political, legal, colonial law and how it adversely affects indigenous food systems and the idea of our connection to our lands and how that is a facilitator to how we have our relationships with food. So I want to thank you, Wilalin, and Umsut Nugam, all Malaysians.
Wow, Cook's-Jam, thank you, Sagach. When I first heard you speaking to this this reality from within the terms, the political terms and the historical terms that you lay out so well for us, I heard you speak at a strategic planning meeting in my home territory, and it was. It's very important to set the context that you covered so much of that I think highlights a lot of real contradictions in our work, which is exactly what we need to really be realizing more fully as people of all color mobilize to work in solidarity with Indigenous people and Black people, people of color, who experience systemic oppression. I think realizing the reality of Indigenous peoples that, you know, many of our elders say there will be no justice on stolen land, no justice for anybody, because the karma, the underlying karma, the energy that underlies the food that's being grown in a productionist paradigm and a resource extraction framework that views our food and our land and our water as a resource to be exploited to an external means in a capitalist economy, that is in direct contradiction to our relationship-based kind of responsibility to the land and the water as Indigenous peoples. There are 500 million Indigenous peoples on the planet, and it's well known and well documented we play a significant role in maintaining the remaining fragments of biodiversity and cultural heritage in the land and food system. We maintain 22% of the world's land surface, yet we're only 5% of the population. And in Canada, we only have access to 0.02% of all of the land base that has been, quote unquote, allocated through the system, the very unjust system that we cannot achieve food sovereignty without our land back. There's a whole gathering that I know many Indigenous peoples within the Indigenous circle have been serving as advisors to Food Secure Canada. You know, we're talking about organizing our own gathering. I think you and I also talked about that, Sakej, because we could talk for a whole week just on that topic alone. But I just wanted to really highlight, you know, that the ways that reality is expressed in agriculture-centric policy and planning and governance structures and processes is very much a part of the very first way in which the land was being grabbed in 1492. And it's been happening ever since. And there are, you know, some of the world's, the top 1%, who are primarily white males, who are going around the planet grabbing what little is left. We're being encroached upon on our elk and our wild salmon and our berries, and you know, there isn't enough food for Indigenous peoples, yet that's being grabbed. Those foods are being grabbed and sold in expensive stores where only the top 1% can afford to eat some of the most nutritious foods on the planet. This is hugely unjust. And we know that the conservation of our Indigenous foodlands means a way to end the genocide, because our health as Indigenous peoples cannot be separated from our lands. And so we really need to dismantle the structures and the processes that have been instituted in the colonial government to really be deep and meaningful when we say we want to reconcile, and we need to truth this. So thank you so for doing that so beautifully and powerfully. Really, really greatly appreciated. So our next speaker, Leslie Campbell. Welcome, Leslie. Leslie works for Toronto Food Share in Toronto, where he supports community-led focused access initiatives, research, and advocacy. His work seeks to broaden conversations about food insecurity to include discussions of the many systems of oppression that hold it in place. Systems like colonialism, capitalism, systemic racism, and patriarchy. Leslie also currently sits on the board of directors of Makeway, which is formerly Tides Canada, and he is a member of the Toronto Food Policy Council and works as a food systems research consultant. He believes strongly in income-based solutions to food insecurity as implemented alongside university accessible public services, and in the need for those most impacted by these issues to lead the solutions finding process. So Leslie, I'm super grateful for that you were able to join us and that you're going to share the amazing research you did to give a data-oriented, using the tools of the oppressor in a Western science-based kind of techno-bureaucratic framework. The contradiction of that is beautiful because you've done a really great job, and we're really excited to hear what you have to share.
Thank you so much, Dawn, for that introduction and for having me as part of this panel. I will just quickly begin sharing my screen. And we'll start the slideshow. Can you just flash me a thumbs up if you can see the slides on the screen now? Perfect. Okay, thank you. So good morning and also good afternoon to everyone joining us today. And thank you to the Cultivating Change organizing staff, Food Secure Canada and particularly to Dawn for inviting me to be part of the plenary panel alongside my fellow incredible fellow co-panelists, Alana, Sakej, and Sarah. I couldn't be more excited for the opportunity to share and to listen and learn alongside all of you today. And my portion of this session is titled Race and Food Insecurity in Canada, Moving Beyond the Data. During our time together, I'm going to share a little bit about myself and how I came to this conversation. I'll also be providing an overview of Food Share Toronto and the work that we do alongside community. I'll then share some research about food insecurity in Canada, specifically focusing on the Black community. And we'll close by discussing how we might move beyond this data to explore larger questions. So, as I mentioned, my name is Leslie Campbell. I'm the Senior Coordinator of Special Projects with Food Share Toronto. My work includes research and support for community-led food access initiatives, advocacy, and partnership building as we seek the realization of the government's commitment to uphold the right to food for all communities in Canada. Although we are still a long way from this future, one of the things that I've been taught along the way is that we cannot understand where we are going unless we also have an idea of where we have been. So I wanted to begin by sharing a little bit about the path by which I have come to this work and how it informs my perspective. My story begins in the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. These lands are also currently known by many as Markham, Ontario. As a child, my maternal grandmother, Joan, would pull me onto her lap and tell me stories of what it was like for her growing up in rural Alberta during the Great Depression, and how she used to spend summers helping her father on the farm at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta. She told me that farming was in our family, and she taught me that stories were important. I also spent time on farms growing up, on field trips and visits with my family. The farmers we interacted with almost never looked like me. They were almost always white. Despite not seeing myself reflected in those spaces, these sorts of experiences inspired me to explore food further in school and led me to study tropical food systems. Navigating those academic spaces, my classmates and I were taught both implicitly and explicitly to see the world through a white-led techno-bureaucratic lens. We were taught that data is valuable and that decision-making should be based on quantifiable empirical evidence and Western science. These were all framed as the right ways to do things. We were not taught in the same way that these ways of seeing and knowing were just one of many valid ways of understanding and navigating the world. After leaving school, I was drawn to agriculture work in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and East Africa, where I finally had the opportunity to live and work alongside farmers who looked more like myself and who were drawing from practices and wisdom that was fundamentally different from the Eurocentric mindset I had been taught to value in school. Over years, working alongside these farmers, learning about traditional agricultural practices and grappling with different ways and practices of agriculture in different parts of the world, I began to recognize that in these contexts, my skills as someone from Canada were highly valued in the eyes of others. I was so captivated and pulled in by the power that involved. It felt so good to be listened to. So naturally, I talked. But in fact, I should have been listening. In that context, my knowledge was often misplaced or inappropriate compared to the knowledge of local peasant farmers or other experts from these places who better understood the cultures and traditions of their lands than I. For example, we are looking at a picture of me speaking to a farmer in Thailand, when in retrospect, I should have been spending much more of my time with my mouth shut, simply listening, learning, and amplifying what I was hearing from community members more knowledgeable than I, who were speaking about the things that they saw and had experienced. As a result of this growing recognition, in 2016, I made the difficult choice to leave this work and return home. In seeking work back home, I was drawn to an organization called Food Share Toronto because it was an organization talking about food insecurity, which I cared about and had witnessed the impacts of both in Canada and internationally. But they were also talking about systemic oppressions like racism and white supremacy, the sorts of things that I and people in communities like mine disproportionately experience, but that I had never seen held up publicly as an important part of the larger conversations about food and food systems. It just felt right. The organization was led by someone with lived experience that reflected the communities it worked alongside and ran programs that were prioritized based on the experiences of the people who needed them. I did not know it at the time, but I was seeing food justice work up close for the first time. As a food justice nonprofit, FoodShare believes that dismantling systems of oppression like colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, and systemic racism must be part of the solution to food insecurity. FoodShare supports a range of programming that include over 50 community-led markets like the one in this picture, which sell fresh fruits and vegetables at affordable prices to local residents. These markets are community-led, but because FoodShare operates by listening to communities and works to support their priorities through the programming that is developed. Although our programs are universal so that anyone can access, we recognize that not everyone faces the same barriers in accessing the money they need for food, and that Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities, for example, face greater barriers than others due to issues like systemic racism. This is a position that has been informed by the community members that we work alongside, who speak frequently about the barriers that they and their neighbors are forced to navigate. We haven't historically had much race-based data on these issues, but in observing and listening to what community members were saying, FoodShare supported them to develop these markets. But we kept being told how important it was to have data by funders, by partners, and by the society in which we operate. To address this lack of data on race, in 2019, FoodShare partnered with Valerie Tarasuk and Simran Dana of the Proof Food Insecurity Research Team at the University of Toronto to conduct one of the first studies in Canada looking at food insecurity data through the lens of race. The question that drove this study was, how do Black and white populations in Canada differ in their risk of household food insecurity? Data was pooled from Canada Community Health Survey respondents from 2005 to 2014 to obtain a total sample size of almost 500,000 data points, which were then analyzed through descriptive analysis and modeling to look for race-based trends. And this is what we found. The data showed that when you compare the percentage of white and Black households in Canada facing food insecurity, we see that 10% of white households are food insecure compared with 28% of Black households. When you compare this to the approximately 12% average rate of food insecurity in Canada, it's clear that Black households experience food insecurity at far greater rates than both the national average and white households. The study also highlighted huge race-based inequities in the risk of household food insecurity. The statistics showed that Black households in Canada are about 3.6 times more likely to be food insecure than white households. This was when looking at the full data set without controlling for any other factors. The data was also adjusted to control for variables like education, household composition, income, home ownership, province, and immigration status. Even after all of this, Black households were still found to be 1.88 times, almost twice as likely to be food insecure than white households. So what does this mean? Based on the analysis, the research suggests that the higher food insecurity prevalence that remains among Black households after controlling for all of these variables is at least in part due to the additional economic barriers these households face because they are Black. These findings on food insecurity in the Black community reflect similar manifestations of systemic neglect, racism, and colonialism that have been observed in Indigenous communities, as highlighted by many other separate studies. This presentation focuses largely on the Black community, but there is so much information on similar trends in the Indigenous community, as Sakej has previously shared, and I encourage all of you to go out and explore it. But I will share just one data point to illustrate this piece. Food insecurity among off-reserve Indigenous households in Canada is 3 times higher than non-Indigenous households. And that rate jumps even higher when you focus on remote communities lacking year-round road access, according to studies by the Government of Canada and others. So imagine, it is 2019. The Food Share and Proof study on Black household food insecurity was done. The data was presented, and immediately we noticed a shift in the conversation. These statistics you're seeing on the screen landed on the front page of the Toronto Star. The story was also carried by other outlets like the CBC and the Globe and Mail. The study's stats were also quoted days later on the floor of provincial parliament by Laura May Lindo, official opposition critic for anti-racism, citizenship, and immigration. As I said previously, these statistics reflect what community leaders in the Black community had been saying for years. Leaders like my colleagues, Letitia Diewo of Black Creek Community Farm, Anan Lololi of African Food Basket, Cheyenne Sundance of Sundance Harvest, and many, many, many others. Although some were listening before, there were and still are many who will say, well, we don't have the numbers, so it's hard to say for sure. So a couple of items jump out at us here as we move beyond the data to understand and think about what it means. First is the idea that these statistics demonstrate the impacts of systems like capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy, alongside the ongoing impacts of documents like the Indian Act. They highlight the Canadian government's failure to uphold their commitment to ensuring the right to food for all Canadians. Many now understand that food insecurity is about a lack of access to money. Additional barriers faced by communities like the Black and Indigenous community in accessing money due to systems like structural racism lead to extra difficulty doing everything else we want to do. It is also suggested that if one can access the money they need, many other issues related to poverty and food insecurity diminish as well. Secondly, these statistics highlight one of the many shared connections between the struggle for Indigenous self-determination, liberation, and independence, which, as has been previously referenced, includes Indigenous food sovereignty, and the struggle for Black liberation and independence, which includes Black food sovereignty. Both of these struggles are confronting systems of white supremacy that largely determine which communities face the greatest barriers in accessing money and resources, and therefore who experiences the most food insecurity. To paraphrase Minneapolis-based slam poet and MC, El Guante, white supremacy is not the shark, it is the water. Remember, sharks kill about 1 person per year, while over 3,300 drown. This feels to me like another way of saying that we must address the underlying issues holding these problems in place. Food insecurity is linked to poverty. Poverty is linked to the legacy of colonialism and systemic racism. Therefore, any work to dismantle colonialism, move toward reconciliation, and address systemic racism is also moving us collectively towards improved food security for communities disproportionately impacted by these systems. But we still face many barriers in this struggle, one of which is a lack of data. It is important to reflect on these studies and this data that I've just presented. This data reflects exactly what community leaders from Indigenous communities and Black communities across Canada have been saying for decades and decades and decades. Why, therefore, is it seen as so much more valid when there is data? This over-reliance on data, or the idea that we can't move on a problem or issue, even one that people are shouting from the rooftops about, until we have the data, is also part of a system that values data above all else. Above alternative ways of knowing and seeing, above Indigenous oral histories, above anecdotal reports from community, above traditional knowledge, and many more. This tendency can also help to reinforce white supremacy and white-led solution finding and delegitimize other ways of seeing and knowing. Communities are calling for more data on these issues, but we must also recognize that the need for data is part of a larger problem. Let's take a moment to think about why we do not have much race-based data in the first place. To get the funds to do a study, you usually need a grant. To get a grant, you usually need to belong to an academic institution. Academic institutions have historically discriminated in the recruitment processes, so those who make it to these positions have been historically disproportionately white and male. Lots of qualified folks also face financial barriers to getting paid qualifications, the qualifications needed to get these jobs. Racialized folks who do make it to these spaces often face microaggressions and many other workplace hostilities, and sometimes choose to leave rather than put up with them. This is why it has been mostly white, male, straight, upper middle class voices at the table driving the question generation process and ultimately determining what data gets gathered. In this context, it is little wonder that there has not been historically a focus on gathering race-based data in racialized communities, especially when this data tends to reinforce the idea that we live in a society largely constructed through a system of gross and often race-based inequities. Although many institutions are working to address these problems, we are still a long way from having enough Black, Indigenous, and other racialized folks in positions of decision-making power to drive the question generation and data gathering processes in these spaces. As a result, the idea that we must wait to have data, especially race-based data, before acting is a kind of idea that reinforces white supremacy, inaction, and the maintenance of a white-led system of values. This also connects to the same Eurocentric framework of values used to justify the ongoing subjugation of Indigenous people and to justify institutions like the prison industrial complex, which disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities. While they may not be identical in scope, they are connected to the same system of values. This is ultimately about who controls the conversation about what questions get asked, which topics get explored, and how, and ultimately about what we value. We lack so much of the hard empirical data, race-based or otherwise, that we need to answer these important questions because of who has historically been empowered to ask questions and gather data. As we think about what we in our systems value, let us consider that perhaps the systems we are using to think about what is true and valid are also mixed up in that water of white supremacy, and that people and communities not served by that system of values are drowning as a result. In preparing for this panel, I was encouraged by our incredible moderator, Dawn, to think critically about these questions. I certainly don't have all the answers, and given that all of you are about to sit through 10 days of incredible speakers and sharing of knowledge, I thought it might be fitting to leave you with questions instead of answers, to ponder and return to as you move through this conference. I have been taught that in the Indigenous tradition, the coyote often plays the role of the trickster and teaches ethics through bad behavior. In this way, Dawn and others teach that coyote questions can help identify gaps of knowledge, and that the potential to do research and make systems change is often living within those gaps of knowledge. I love this idea. So the questions I want to leave you with are, number one, what if we cannot afford to wait to prove what is needed and where before taking action? When I say prove, I mean prove with data. If enough people from a community say that something is a problem for them and their neighbors, why is that not enough to take action on that issue? Number two, how might we shift what we value to better reflect and affirm a wider diversity of lived experiences and ways of knowing? I think this plenary and Dawn's cross-cultural interface framework is a beautiful illustration of this. And number three, finally, what if reports from communities of lived realities of disenfranchisement and systemic oppression were enough to justify radical transformative intervention, even in the absence of data? Like many of FoodShare's programs illustrate, sometimes you can simply move forward based on what you hear from community to build something that responds to a need people are talking about. But this requires us all to listen. Ultimately, what we are saying is this: racialized communities cannot afford to wait for the data because the problems we face are too urgent, too big, and too complex. I do not pretend to speak for any entire community, but I think that we cannot and we must not wait for every piece of data to act on these issues and to make policy changes, to broaden our ways of knowing, and to address the systems of oppression that lead to these outcomes and dismantle them. It is time to begin truly listening and responding to the things that communities are saying and asking for. It is time for us to recognize that data is just one narrow way of knowing, and that we don't always need to wait to see the data to understand when our house is on fire. Thank you.
Wow, I am so grateful. How beautifully laid out, and what a beautiful piece of work. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Black and Indigenous and people of color who sit in the research institutes, in those colonial institutes, and endure the rigor of doing research within their data-oriented methodologies and such. It's very powerful to be in that contradiction of actually using the tools, but also speaking to the truths. So I'm really super grateful, a young Black man such as yourselves, and the work that you've brought to this plenary and the thinking, and so grateful that you've what you've highlighted here. About 2018, myself and Paul Taylor and a group of Indigenous and Black peoples who had attended the Food Secure Canada gathering that was happening in Montreal at that time, we led a boycott of the assembly on the very last day of the assembly to name the structural racism we were experiencing, both in the ways we were experiencing the white supremacy in terms of narrative, and the ways that the gathering was organized and the program, and yeah, just how the decisions were made to get to that place as an organization. We really called out the Food Secure Canada, and they stepped up, and they since restructured their whole board. They have, as Melina said earlier, half of their board is now Black and Indigenous peoples. And they've really done an amazing job to organize this gathering in a way that really centers our experience, that is very meaningful. And I'm deeply grateful, because what you spoke about in terms of the institutional frameworks for research and development, and the very problematic nature of the way that that favors white supremacy, white supremacist narrative, and a white supremacist framework for policy planning and governance. And until that changes, it's what's the word? It's very tokenistic to say that we're going to, you know, end racism or address racism, or to be in a just transition that includes both social justice and environmental justice. So I feel like you've what you brought to the panel is it highlights the need, the contention of working within these institutional frameworks where we cannot reconcile. There is a huge contradiction in the ways that the food system is being governed. And so I think one of the things that's always attracted me to Food Secure Canada, even though in the very first gathering I ever went to back in 2004, that was in Winnipeg at the time, the first words out of my mouth in the forum were that just by nature of the name of Food Secure Canada and working at a pan-Canadian approach is very problematic for Indigenous peoples, because we have 98 nations of Indigenous territories, sovereign. You know, we use the term sovereign. I think Saget highlighted, you know, the ways, the definition of sovereign, and the ways that that word, it's the English language. And it's problematic in terms of the root meaning of that word in the English language. But we use it because it brings us deeper into understanding how to address the underlying issues, rather than food security, which is important too. But food security, I mean, it's also a very technical, problematic word in some terms, in terms of how food was a tool of the colonizers to be able to build this corporate empire. And so there's so much that I could phrase and paraphrase, and I'm just kind of rambling here because I think I'm just really trying to highlight the things that many of our elders and our people within this networking and learning events that we've organized over the years, what we've heard them say. And so we know this as Indigenous and Black people and people experiencing systemic oppression, that it's actually the system that, but there's, while engaging at a pan-Canadian approach is a very imperialistic scale to be engaging at, but the reason we do that is because it's a people's movement, and that people's movement means that as we shift and cultivate change for a just transition within the people's movement, that we can build, become relevant enough to where these systems, these archaic systems and structures are become irrelevant. So, you know, the living reality in terms of the laws and policies that that are being asserted by the colonial government, there are two different things, because we see a lot of the laws and policies that are framed around, especially Indigenous land title and rights and such, are not being implemented. So it's a call to action on a lot of different levels, including the institutional level. So thank you again for that, and I look forward to continuing our work together as we scale this movement out even more so.
I very much do as well. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Okay, so I want to say I appreciate, I did put a request in the chat window to all the panelists and attendees that we extend the timeline of this plenary so that we can give our next speaker, Sarah Dent, a fair and adequate amount of time to speak. And also so we have a few discussions or a little bit of time for a little bit of discussion at the end. And so it looks like most people are agreeable to that. I encourage you though, if you do need to leave, we understand, but if you can stay, that would be amazing, because Sarah brings an important piece as well. And I will, Sarah and I are friends, and we have a lot of difficult discussions, and she holds space for that. And she's really showing up in a good way to be in this space of contradiction and contention, and she is showing the courage to come onto the plenary today. And yeah, I think giving her enough time is important so that we're not kind of tokenizing her as the only person with white skin on the panel, and having the courage to come and in that privilege she carries and talks and shares her experience and her insights and her work as a leader in the Young Agrarians movement. So I will read you her bio to introduce her properly, and then I will hand it over. So Sarah is the executive director and co-founder of Young Agrarians. And Sarah is the Young Agrarians is a network for new and young ecological farmers in Canada. Sarah has 20+ years of experience growing youth programs, fundraising, building community, and working for social change. Sarah began farming in 2006, and in 2008 took the Linnea Ecological Garden Program and Permaculture Design course on Cortes Island. Sarah's farm adventures have taken her across Canada and to Mexico. She has 15 years of knowledge and experience in ecological agriculture and food systems. Alongside learning how to farm and grow food, Sarah's also worked with Power of Hope and studied the art of facilitation for groups to grow social ecologies. Sarah dreams of a world where both the ecology of the land and the ecology of the gut are at the heart of modern culture, and through the regeneration of our land, food systems, and cultures, we can grow healthier and abundant systems. So I'll hand it over for Sarah to share what she's prepared for us, and then I will take it from there in terms of leading us into a bit of a discussion. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Dawn. It is such an honor to be here. I can feel from the tips of my toes all the way up into my hands and to my mind, the deep appreciation and gratitude that I have to be here today, to be invited to speak with such an incredible panel of people from Sakej, giving us the history and talking about agrarian law, colonial government, to learning more from Leslie about food insecurity for people of color today on these lands, to Dawn, the wealth of knowledge that you bring, your incredible ability to curate and to lead us through, guide us through an Indigenous framework for working through these different concepts and questions and all of the different contentions that we're living in and working through today. So I'm speaking to you all from Tlaman territory here on the West Coast. And I'm going to share a bit of information about myself, my background, and my journey into farming and the work that we're doing today with young agrarians. And I just want to begin by saying that as a white person working within the food system, specifically in agriculture and farming, it is essential to unpack my privilege daily. I'm constantly aware of my white privilege, my white skin, the privilege that I have as somebody that raises money for programs, interfaces with government on a regular basis, and yet stands on these precious, precious Indigenous lands that we are so lucky to be able to be on today. So I was, just starting with my background, I was born in Toronto, raised in Vancouver. I'm 3/4 Eastern European Jewish and 1/4 WASP, as we would so jokingly call it when we were growing up, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And I grew up in a post-war, post-Holocaust family. My grandparents were Canadian communists, and they fought for workers' rights, human rights, healthcare, some of the social programs that we have today in Canada. They were on the front lines of that work. My grandfather, actually during Alana's visualization, I sat here today with my grandfather and my grandmother on either side of me yesterday in Remembrance Day, thinking about my grandfather who went and fought in the Spanish Civil War as a volunteer with the International Brigades against fascism, came back after a year to Canada, went back and fought in World War II in Normandy. And it was illegal at the time for communists to be part of the Canadian Army. And he went and did those things and was lucky enough to come back to Canada and, you know, live his life into his 70s. And so my family, my extended family are Jewish, Black, and now First Nations. My sister's partner is First Nations. And we were raised in that post-genocide context to understand whose lands we were on, to understand racism, to think about residential schools, and how could we, with our privilege, work towards a better future? How can we use that privilege? I've always felt that it has been my responsibility to do something to try and make the world a better place. And that was I think my main point of inquiry when I went to university and studied liberal arts and studied communications, was to figure out why this world was so screwed up. Like what were these ways of thinking? My studies were really steeped in that Western civilization and culture, and thinking through how did we end up in the current paradigm that we're in, the neoliberal paradigm that we exist in today. So after I finished university, I went to the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, Brazil. My grandmother, my communist grandmother, had passed away and had left me a small amount of money, and I used that money to go to Brazil and get to attend this global forum, the counter forum to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, where the leaders of the world come together to strategize neoliberal policy. I got to go to the opposite forum in Porto Alegre, which runs on a participatory budgetary system, where people, when they vote, they decide how their capital is spent rather than voting for political parties. And it was at that time that I started to think more about food and farming, with exposure to the landless workers movement in Brazil, and getting to learn more about that, and land seizures and the desperate conditions for people who have been disenfranchised from their land base. And so coming back to Canada, I started doing some speaking about World Social Forum and organizing around World Social Forum, and started working with an organization called Power of Hope, going through the Power of Hope training. Power of Hope is a youth arts empowerment organization that uses facilitation to empower community, empower groups to work together, to collaborate, to increase leadership and increase empowerment. And in that Power of Hope space, I was able to work constantly in a community with people of color, with Indigenous youth, and the norm within the Power of Hope organization was that we were constantly in spaces where we were working interculturally, and you know, coming from the background that I've come from, growing up in a family of color, a Jewish family, one of the things that I really had to lean into during that process of learning about facilitation is, despite my own cultural narrative that is my fabric of my being, when I walk into a room, when I walk into a space, I am a white woman. I bring that whiteness, I bring that privilege, and that is something that I need to constantly acknowledge and constantly work with, in the sense that my role is to listen, to hold space, not to be directional, to work alongside. And currently, as the executive director of Young Agrarians, to figure out how to push resources into spaces where resources need to go, but not be directional about those spaces. So from that community-based facilitation framework, learning about building social ecology, and social ecologies, and thinking about, why are we still here today with all the destruction that has taken place on this planet? And I truly believe it's because there's people working all over the world, Indigenous, non-Indigenous people, that are keeping us here. It's the social fabric that is keeping us here in the world today as we continue to consume the ecological fabric of this world. And I started my farming journey in 2006. I started learning how to farm, coming from an urban background. I had no experience working the land or farming. I had no idea how to grow things. And when I started doing that work, it was like all of this study and work and activism and trying to figure out why the world was screwed up. It was like a giant light bulb went on over my head around applied activism and activism with my hands, and activism that is like really engaged with the earth, one that is so very healing. And I began to deepen my learning into farming, got to do a farm school program, and got to work on farms and be part of farms and do that in Canada, and also got to spend some time in Mexico in a farming community there, and learning about subtropical farming, agriculture, permaculture. And so that has led over the years up into working on Young Agrarians. And so I'm the co-founder of Young Agrarians. At the time when we named Young Agrarians, it was around Wendell Berry's writing about agrarianism, bringing back country-based or pastoral values around the land, around the soil, around nature, around ecology, and bringing that back as a system of values. And somehow in my studies of political science and the Western techno-bureaucratic framework, I did not have a very comprehensive understanding of agrarianism and that agrarian terminology within the history of colonialization. So if anybody wants to help me think through the rebranding of Young Agrarians, just let me know, because that word in and of itself is it's ripe with the coyote question around colonialism versus indigeneity, and that change, I think, that we're hoping to manifest in this world. So I'm going to speak about Young Agrarians for a few minutes and talk about that work. Young Agrarians really got going because we started to organize on farm, farmer to farmer, bringing that Power of Hope community-based facilitation model into the farming community. And at the time, what I was noticing was that a lot of new and young people did not know the other people in their communities. There's a huge amount of isolation in the farming community. And we started to organize basically events on farms, and the community building model really sprung up, and it spread across Canada from coast to coast. And what we were seeing was a deep need from an emerging generation of people that were getting into farming because of their social and ecological values, that there was a need to gather, there was a need for knowledge transfer, and that a lot of people were experiencing barriers around the main entry barriers into farming today are land, capital, knowledge, and that we were working with a generation of people that were coming in because ecology was their priority. And I think most people in this panel today are probably pretty well versed in the industrial agriculture model, which is a post-war model. 1.6% or 1.7% of the Canadian population are farming today, and 9% of those are 35 and younger. There's probably about 25,000 farm operators who are in that 35 and younger category today in Canada. 25,000. And so there's a very small number of people in farming, and that's because as the farming population has gone from small farms across the country and aggregated into these larger industrial entities, we've lost huge numbers of people on the land base. And we now have a very tiny percentage of our population that are farming. And they're farming within a highly contentious colonial land enclosure system that operates at the individuated farm level, which continues to fragment and polarize our ecologies in terms of landscape level thinking for ecology, for wilderness, for the creatures, and for the water, and for this dire need that we're in to heal this relationship with the land. In order to have a population that has better food access, that has healthier food access, that has access to food that is grown with love, land that is cared for, and social cultural ecologies of place that are intercultural, where we have increased relational fields between settler and non-settler. And this is one of the spaces that Young Agrarians is really feeling into today. We do a land matching program in BC, British Columbia, currently where we're supporting farmers to lease land. And we work with all sorts of different people. We work with people of color through that program. Often we're working with people of color in areas that are closer to urban centers. And then a lot of the rural areas that we're working in tend to have a lot more white farmer populations. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I felt over the years coming from the Power of Hope space and my family space into the farming community is that the segregation is just so obvious. Increasingly, as I organized, it was being in spaces with more and more white farmers, more and more white people, inviting Indigenous leadership into those spaces to bring education, and realizing that while there are some farmers in the community, again, not all white, but there are some farmers in the community that really care about anti-oppression and anti-racism and want to be doing this work at the community level, there isn't enough training in anti-oppression, and like that ability to actually work within intercultural spaces to grow collaboration. And I believe as like a white person of, it's in the position that I'm in, it's the training that I've had in the spaces that I've been in that has allowed me to be in spaces of color and work with people of color, and hopefully work with people of color in a good way, in the best way that I can possibly put my foot forward. And just another small piece that I want to just bring into the narrative that I'm bringing here today is this very critical piece around gut health and soil health. And thinking about that in terms of Indigenous peoples losing their land, losing their food systems, and losing the very ecologies inside of the body that keep us healthy and keep us well. And thinking about the destruction that has happened at the health level for people when they're not able to access good foods, and all the kind of industrialization that we have through our medical system, and that internal erosion, and unpacking that, and thinking about ways that we can rebuild that biology and that healthy biology. I think that that's like this really key piece that a lot of people are starting to interface with around this kind of gut health, soil health axiom, and how that trauma loop continues to create disparities within our own internal ecologies as we're thinking about rebuilding ecologies on the landscape. So what is that marriage between social ecologies, intercultural spaces where we can work together and work within the contradiction of the systems that we're in today, understanding the oppression that people are facing, and understanding how is it that we have a future food growing system with people that are able to grow food on the land in ecological, in diverse, in just ways that is going to support the populations that we have today in our current culture and the current crises that we're facing globally. So again, from the bottom of my heart, I'm so grateful, so deeply grateful to be able to speak in this space, for the invitation today, Dawn, to be here today. And yeah, I think that may be the offering that I have. That's the offering that I have.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that. There's I think it's really good for us to all know where we're at in terms of the movement on the ground. And what I've appreciated a lot, even though I find a lot of tension in the movement of young agrarians, white settler folk who are mobilizing in their privilege and power, many acknowledging it and willing to truth it, such as yourself, and many who aren't. And everybody's at a different place in their decolonizing, including me and my gut. But there is a lot of tension in that work that we hold as Indigenous and Black people, people of color. But I think it's important to realize and kind of accept where we're at. And I think your work helps us to give us a good idea of what, part of what gives me hope is knowing that a lot of the young white settler friends and allies want to make change. And it's that young energy that excites me. And I know there is a lot of contention around still. I think one of the ways the privilege that you acknowledge is expressed most glaringly and most unjustly is through land. I know that you're grappling with that issue as well. Some young white settler folk are having a hard time as well accessing land because of the corporate, the top 1% who are going around grabbing the remaining fragments of the best land. As Indigenous peoples, we know they've always taken the best land first. In my own territory, now they're grabbing what's left. And it's not just the land, it's the water, it's the infrastructure. We know that there's a lot of imbalances in privilege and power, and that us as Indigenous and people of color don't have the same capacity to run organizations and get the same amount of funding and to establish and consolidate the infrastructure and the land, because we don't have the same capacity, and we actually won't work in that system of land policy because it doesn't speak to us. It would be you know, even for those who do attempt to work under duress in that system, it takes a really long time and a lot of capacity, which we don't have. So I really appreciate what you've highlighted for us and the way you show up for that. And it's challenging work, but I do have hope. The power of hope that you mentioned, I think rests within the youthful energy and some of the networks that are mobilizing. I know National Farmers Union is also doing that work. Food Secure Canada, there's a lot of young white settler folk on the board, Suzanne and Naomi and Emily and others who are on this, doing this work with Food Secure Canada are also, you know, been involved in this work, and I think coming to understand and acknowledge that. So it is 10 minutes past what I had asked people to stay until 2:30 Eastern time, 11:30 Pacific time. So I'm wondering, it feels like we don't have much time for discussion. I know Jolene is waiting, and there are some people waiting to get support, some Indigenous focus oriented therapy support. Jolene Andrew, who is one of our newest members of the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty and our team of staff. She's been trained in the Indigenous focus oriented therapy, and she's on standby, willing to support people if there was any trauma or anything that you feel needs to be cleared and you'd like support in that, so that we can go away from this and embody more of a health relational practice in this work to dismantle structural racism in the land and food system. But I guess I'm just wondering, Jolene has very generously offered to stay longer. If there was maybe one question or something, I don't know if people want to do that or if we should just sign off. I'm willing to stay longer, but I also, somebody give me a sign, either a question or say, no, it's time to go. Okay, I'm being asked to sign off because again, there are people waiting to go into the meeting with Jolene. And again, it's been 10 minutes over time and I don't see any questions in the chat window anyways. So, I mean, there were some earlier. I think one of the questions was around how white settler folk can support people in terms of institutional frameworks. And I think around capacity and funding is probably the most ways to help balance out some of those imbalances of funding and capacity. But that's a longer conversation, so we'll leave that for now. And thank you, everybody. I really, really hope that you see a lot of potential that lives in the gaps of knowledge and some strategies. We'll be reflecting on that within the themes that were offered at the beginning of the plenary, and sharing some of those strategies and potential out in the closing plenary. So thank you again, everyone, for sitting through and valuing this topic important enough to sit through and spend the extra time doing that. Cookscham, Salton, all my relations.
So Dawn, the recording will be available on Facebook as well, or is it just only live?
Rachel, can you answer that question?
Hi there. Yes, so recording will be sent out to all the registrants within 2 to 3 days' time. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Thank you, Dawn, and thank you to all of the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.